He was born to inherit a kingdom, yet he died penniless. This is not a fairy tale curse. It is the true story of Prince Andrew of Yugoslavia. His is not a tale of battles and treaties, but of the true cost of a lost crown. It is not the cost in land or jewels, but the cost to a human soul, a soul that was ultimately crushed by the weight of its own legacy. So forget the history, This is the story of a boy who lost everything and spent the rest of his life trying to pick up the pieces. But this dream of unity came at a cost. To hold the ethnically divided country together, Alexander declared a royal dictatorship in 1929, the very year Andrew was born. His iron-fisted rule created stability, but also bred dangerous enemies, turning the kingdom into a political powder keg. This was the volatile, high-stakes world that awaited the new prince. On the 28th of June, 1929, Queen Maria gave birth to her third son, Andrei, not in the formal grandeur of the capital, Belgrade, but in the idyllic retreat of Bled. Located in the Slovenian Alps, Bled, with its fairy tale castle perched on a cliff and its serene emerald green lake, was a world away from the political turmoil of the capital. It was the royal family's sanctuary, a place of peace and natural beauty. The choice of Bled for his birth was symbolic of the family's connection to all parts of their diverse kingdom. In young Andrew's world, his father was an iron-fisted king, but here he was just a father. His brother Peter was the heir, burdened by destiny. His brother Tomislav was spirited and loud. And what about Andrew? He was the youngest son, the sensitive, quiet one. He was the observer, the child who stood behind the velvet curtains, watching the world of adults without truly understanding it. He would have been just old enough to sense the unease that permeated the palace. He would have seen the stern, worried faces of the ministers coming and going, heard the hushed conversations of his parents after he was meant to be asleep. He was a child living on the edge of a volcano, unaware that it was about to erupt and consume his world. The eruption came in the autumn of 1934. The political situation in Europe was growing darker. Hitler was in power in Germany, and Mussolini's Italy was aggressively pursuing its own expansionist ambitions. Yugoslavia was caught in a precarious position, trying to balance its alliances and maintain its independence. King Alexander, in an attempt to strengthen ties with France, a key ally, embarked on a state visit. He was keenly aware of the risks. His security services had warned him of multiple assassination plots. Before leaving, he reportedly told his aide, "I have a job to do, and I will do it. If they kill me, that will be the fate of a king." He did not understand what an assassination in Marseille meant. He only knew one thing: his formidable father, the man with the deep voice and the mustache he liked to play with, was never coming home again. The adults whispered words he did not understand: regency, instability. But what Andrew felt most was the silence. The terrible silence of the empty chair at the dining table. The silence in his mother's embrace, an embrace that now always trembled. The death of a king is a historical event. For a 5-year-old boy, it is the collapse of the universe. Imagine the scene at the palace: the weeping staff, the frantic aides, the somber-faced officials. Imagine a young queen, her own immense grief suppressed by the duty to her children and her nation. She had to explain to her 3 young boys that their father was never coming home. For 11-year-old Peter, the news was doubly crushing. In that moment, he was no longer just a boy. He was King Peter II, the ruler of a deeply unstable and now leaderless nation. The return of the king's body was a moment of profound national mourning. As his casket was carried through the streets of Belgrade, Hundreds of thousands of people wept openly. They wept for their lost king, but they also wept for their own uncertain future. For young Andrew, standing beside his mother and brothers, draped in black, the pomp and ceremony of the grand state funeral must have been a terrifying and confusing spectacle. The man who had been his father was now a symbol, a martyr, his personal loss swallowed up by a great historical tragedy. The tragedy of that day in Marseille did not just create a fatherless prince, it created a broken queen. Before the assassination, Queen Maria, known affectionately as Mignon, was the vibrant heart of the court. A great-granddaughter of both Britain's Queen Victoria and Russia's Tsar Alexander II, she embodied the interconnectedness of European royalty. She was a modern woman, a skilled driver and artist, who brought a quiet grace and warmth that softened her husband's stern image. She was the velvet glove to his iron fist. But the assassin's bullet killed more than the king. It killed the woman she once was. Overnight, she retreated from public life, swapping her royal gowns for the stark black of a widow. Her world shrank to the palace walls, her sole purpose now the protection of her 3 sons from the dangerous world that had taken their father. For Andrew, this meant the loss of 2 parents. His father was gone, and his mother, though physically present, was now a figure shrouded in a permanent, untouchable grief. The warmth of his childhood had been replaced by a somber chill, and the duty to his nation became a wall around his mother's heart. That day in Marseille did more than just kill a king. It shattered the innocence of a young prince and set his life on a trajectory he could never have imagined. The golden cage of his childhood was broken, but he was not set free. Instead, he and his family were cast adrift into a storm that was gathering over Europe, a storm that would eventually sweep away their kingdom, their home, and their very identity. The stability they had known was gone forever, replaced by a regency led by their uncle, Prince Paul, a man who now had the impossible task of steering Yugoslavia through the treacherous waters leading to the Second World War. For Prince Andrew, the quiet, sensitive boy from Bled, the first great tragedy of his life was complete, but it was only the beginning of a long and painful journey. In Belgrade, the people celebrated a coup. His brother Peter was declared of age at 17 and placed on the throne. The world praised Yugoslavia for having found its soul. And in England, in his school dormitory, what did Andrew feel? Was it pride, or was it a vague, terrifying fear? His uncle, a man he knew, was now branded a traitor. His brother, a boy he grew up with, was suddenly a hero. His family was once again being torn apart. For Queen Maria and her 2 younger sons, Tomislav and Andrei, the world had now completely collapsed. They were already in England, but now their status changed overnight. They were no longer just members of a foreign royal family living abroad. They were exiles, refugees. Their country was occupied, their people were suffering under a brutal regime, and their property and fortunes were lost. They were now entirely dependent on the hospitality of their British allies, particularly their cousin, King George VI. They moved from one rented country house to another, living a life of quiet desperation and gnawing uncertainty, watching the war unfold from afar. For Prince Andrew, now a boy of 12, this was the second and far more complete destruction of his world. The assassination of his father had been a profound personal loss. This was the loss of everything else: his home, his country, his status, his future. The very ground beneath his feet had dissolved. He was now simply the younger brother of a boy king without a kingdom, living in a foreign land while a savage war raged back home. Within occupied Yugoslavia, a complex and brutal civil war began to rage alongside the war against the occupiers. 2 main resistance movements emerged: the royalist Chetniks, loyal to King Peter, and the communist partisans, led by a charismatic and ruthless organizer named Josip Broz Tito. As the war progressed, the Allies, initially supportive of the Chetniks, began to see Tito's partisans as the more effective and reliable fighting force against the Germans. This shift in allegiance, decided in the war rooms of London and Washington, would seal the fate of the Karageorgevich dynasty. While King Peter and his family prayed for an Allied victory that they believed would restore them to their throne, the political reality on the ground was changing irrevocably. They were becoming irrelevant, pawns in a much larger geopolitical game, huddled in the relative safety of the English countryside. Listening to news of the war on the BBC, Prince Andrew and his family could only wait and hope, unaware that their kingdom was not just being occupied, but was being fundamentally remade, and in the new Yugoslavia that would emerge from the ashes of the war, there would be no place for a king or for his princes. While Andrew navigated the strange world of an English boarding school, his older brother Peter was fighting a battle of his own on a far more public stage. He was King Peter II, but he was a king in name only, a guest in a foreign country, holding court in London hotels and rented offices. He was a teenager burdened with the weight of a dying nation, surrounded by bickering old politicians who recreated the ethnic divides of Yugoslavia in the hallways of the London government in exile. He was under the immense influence of Winston Churchill, a political giant who saw Peter not as a sovereign, but as a strategic piece in the war effort. Peter's personal life became a political crisis. He had fallen deeply in love with Princess Alexandra of Greece, but his desire to marry in the midst of war was seen by many as a frivolous distraction. He went ahead with the marriage, an act of personal happiness that cost him significant political capital and further isolated him. The ultimate betrayal came at the Tehran Conference in 1943. There, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, the architects of the post-war world, made a cold, pragmatic decision. They would abandon the royalist Chetniks and throw their full support behind the communist partisans, led by Josip Broz Tito. Churchill personally delivered the devastating news to Peter, pressuring the young king to publicly disown his own loyalists and recognize Tito. It was a public humiliation. For Andrew, watching his brother struggle from afar was a harsh and terrifying lesson. He saw how a king could be powerless, how loyalty could be discarded for political convenience, and how even a personal love story could be twisted into a weapon. Peter's tragedy foreshadowed his own, a life defined by a grand title but stripped of all real power, a man haunted by what could have been. Peter's slow decline after the war, his financial struggles, his depression, his eventual lonely death in America, was a roadmap of the very path Andrew himself would later walk. Life in exile during the war was a surreal existence. For Prince Andrew, who entered his teenage years during this period, it was a life of profound contradictions. He continued his education at a fine English school, likely following his brothers to institutions like Oundle or Clare College, Cambridge. He wore the uniform of an English schoolboy, studied Shakespeare, and played rugby. He was, on the surface, being molded into a typical member of the British upper class. Yet every night the news on the wireless would bring horrifying dispatches from his homeland. Stories of massacres, of starvation, of heroic battles fought in the mountains of Bosnia and Serbia. He was living in two worlds, the orderly, green, and relatively safe world of the English countryside, and the distant, violent, and chaotic world of Yugoslavia, a place that was more of a painful memory than a home. The government in exile, which was meant to be the beacon of a free Yugoslavia, was itself paralyzed by the very same ethnic divisions that had always plagued the kingdom. Serbian and Croatian politicians bickered endlessly in London, undermining the young king's authority and presenting a dysfunctional front to their allied hosts. King Peter, barely out of his teens, was overwhelmed. He was a young man burdened with the weight of a lost nation, surrounded by aging politicians, and constantly pressured by the formidable figure of Winston Churchill, who was growing impatient with the royalist cause. Amidst this political turmoil, Peter tried to find a measure of personal happiness. He had fallen deeply in love with Princess Alexandra of Greece and Denmark. Their romance was a genuine one, a small flicker of light in the darkness of exile. However, his desire to marry in the midst of the war in 1944 caused a major crisis. Many in his government and among the Serbian people felt it was a deeply inappropriate time for royal celebrations when their country was bleeding. The marriage went ahead, but it further isolated the young king, painting him as a young man distracted by personal matters while his kingdom burned. For his younger brothers, Andrei and Tomislav, watching their brother's struggle was a sobering lesson in the cruel intersection of duty and personal desire. They saw how even a king's love story could become a weapon used against him. But the personal dramas of the royal family were a sideshow to the cold, hard calculus of war. The Allies needed to defeat Hitler, and that meant supporting the most effective anti-German forces on the ground, regardless of their politics. In Yugoslavia, it was becoming undeniably clear that Tito's communist partisans were the more formidable fighting force. While the royalist Chetniks, under General Draža Mihailović, were often plagued by inaction, and in some cases collaboration with the Italians to fight the communists, Tito's forces were tying down dozens of German divisions in relentless, brutal guerrilla warfare. The decision that sealed the monarchy's fate was made in November 1943 at the Tehran Conference. There, the Big Three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, met to chart the course for the rest of the war. Based on military intelligence and pragmatism, they made a fateful choice. All future Allied support would be given to Tito's partisans. The Chetniks, and by extension the monarchy they represented, were to be abandoned. For King Peter and his family, the news was a devastating betrayal. Churchill, the man who had praised Yugoslavia for finding its soul in 1941, was now the architect of its monarchy's demise. The British Prime Minister personally delivered the crushing news to the young king, pressuring him to publicly disown Mihailović and recognize Tito's leadership of the resistance. It was a humiliating political crucifixion. Peter resisted for as long as he could, but he had no leverage. He was a guest in a foreign country, a king with no army and no power. Eventually, he was forced to capitulate. Imagine the atmosphere in the family's home on that day. The hope they had clung to for years, that an Allied victory would mean a triumphant return to a liberated Belgrade, evaporated in an instant. It was the moment their exile became permanent. For Prince Andrew, now 15 years old, this political betrayal would have been a harsh lesson in the realities of power. The world was not governed by right or by loyalty, but by force and by interest. His family's cause, their history, their very birthright, had been sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical strategy. The profound sense of injustice, of being cast aside by the very people they had considered their allies, would fester for a lifetime. As the war in Europe drew to a close in 1945, events in Yugoslavia moved swiftly. With Soviet troops assisting their advance, Tito's partisans marched into Belgrade and took control of the entire country. Tito was the undisputed master of the new Yugoslavia, hailed as a liberator and a national hero. For a brief period, a token regency was established, and the question of the monarchy was left officially undecided, but it was a sham. The communists had no intention of allowing the king to return. The final blow came on November 29, 1945. A constituent assembly, elected in a process completely controlled by the Communist Party, formally voted to abolish the monarchy. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia was dead. In its place rose the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia. A few weeks later, another decree was passed, one that was both symbolic and devastatingly practical. It stripped every member of the Karađorđević family of their Yugoslav citizenship and confiscated all of their personal and dynastic property, from the grand royal palaces in Belgrade down to their private homes and lands. This was the final irrevocable act of erasure. They were no longer just a deposed dynasty. They were now officially stateless, declared enemies of the state with no property, no rights, and no home to return to. The connection to the land their ancestors had fought and died for was brutally severed by a stroke of a pen. The war was over. The world was celebrating peace. But for the Karađorđević family, it was the ultimate defeat. Their new reality began to set in, a reality of diminished status and financial uncertainty. The vast royal fortune was gone. They were left with whatever personal funds they had managed to get out of the country and the support of their royal relatives in Britain and Greece. They were, in essence, aristocrats on a fixed income, a life they were utterly unprepared for. The family, which had been held together by the common cause of the war, now began to drift apart, each member grappling with the reality of this new life. King Peter, now a king in name only, found the adjustment impossible. His marriage grew strained, he struggled with depression and financial problems, and he eventually moved to the United States chasing failed business ventures and living a life that became a slow, sad postscript to his brief dramatic reign. Queen Maria the matriarch settled into a quiet, dignified, and largely reclusive life in Kent, living modestly and mourning for the rest of her days the husband, the country, and the life she had lost. And what of Prince Andrew? He was now 16, a young man on the cusp of adulthood, facing a world that had no designated place for him. The path that had been laid out for him at birth, that of a royal prince of Yugoslavia, with all the duties, privileges, and responsibilities that entailed, had vanished. He had an English education and the polished accent of a British gentleman, but he carried a Serbian name and the title of a non-existent kingdom. He was a man caught between worlds, belonging to neither. He wasn't the head of the family like his brother Peter, who, however diminished, still carried the symbolic weight of the lost crown. He was just the youngest son, a prince of nowhere. The grand historical struggle to reclaim a throne was over. Now, a far more personal and perhaps more difficult struggle was just beginning. The struggle to simply build a life, to find a purpose, to forge an identity from the wreckage of his inheritance. Armed with little more than a famous name and the ghosts of a glorious past, Prince Andrew stepped into the post-war world, a world that had moved on and had little time for the sorrows of a deposed prince. His journey into the long, lonely wilderness of exile had truly begun. The post-war world of exiled royalty in London was a strange and surreal bubble. On the surface, it was a life of privilege. There were debutante balls, cocktail parties in Belgravia, and weekend hunts at country estates. They were a tight-knit community of shared loss, addressing each other by grand titles of kingdoms that no longer existed. They were princes without palaces, princesses without fortunes, all clinging to the rigid etiquette of a world that had vanished. But beneath this glamorous facade was a quiet desperation. This was a life lived on dwindling funds, and the charity of their British royal relatives. It was a life of perpetual waiting, waiting for communism to fall, waiting for an invitation to the right party, waiting for a letter that would never come. Their days were often empty, filled with little more than gossip and nostalgia. They were ghosts at the feast of a victorious Britain, admired for their titles but largely irrelevant to the new world being built around them. It was in this environment that Andrew had to forge an identity. He was taught to behave like a prince, to spend like a prince, and to marry like a prince. Yet he was expected to somehow make a living like a common man, with no training, no capital, and no practical skills beyond social grace. This impossible conflict was the central crisis of his adult life. He was trapped between the expectations of his name and the reality of his bank account, a pressure that would prove to be corrosive, slowly eating away at his confidence and poisoning every relationship he tried to build. For a young man like Andrew, the post-war years in London were a disorienting blend of privilege and poverty. By blood, he was a royal prince. He was a cousin to the British royal family and moved within the highest echelons of a European aristocracy that was trying to piece itself back together. He would have attended debutante balls, country house weekends, and exclusive society events. To an outsider, he was the picture of continental charm and royal mystique, a handsome young prince with a tragic and romantic backstory. But behind this glamorous facade was a gnawing reality. He had the name, but not the means. The vast wealth of the Karađorđević dynasty was locked away behind the Iron Curtain, confiscated by Tito's regime. The family lived on the dwindling funds they had managed to bring into exile in the generosity of relatives. This meant that while Andrew socialized with some of the wealthiest people in the world, he himself was often struggling. This created a deep and damaging internal conflict, the constant pressure to maintain the appearance of royalty on an increasingly threadbare budget. What does a prince with no kingdom do for a living? This was the central, agonizing question of his early adulthood. He had not been educated to be a banker, a lawyer, or an engineer. He had been educated to be a prince. He, like many exiled aristocrats, likely tried to leverage his name and his social connections in the world of business. He may have dabbled in international trade, finance, or consulting, professions where a well-known name could open doors. But doors opened are not the same as deals closed. Without practical experience or significant capital of his own, any venture was fraught with risk. This period was likely marked by a series of hopeful starts and disappointing finishes, each one chipping away at his confidence and deepening his financial precarity. In the midst of this search for purpose, he also searched for personal stability. Like many of his generation, he sought it in marriage. In 1956, it seemed he had found the perfect match. He married Princess Christina Margaret of Hesse, a German noblewoman with impeccable royal connections. She was a niece of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, and a great-great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Their wedding was a significant event for the diminished world of European royalty. It was a union of two displaced dynasties, a moment of defiant glamour, a reassertion of tradition in a world that had moved on. For Andrew, this marriage must have felt like a homecoming, a chance to build a family life that mirrored the secure, royal world he had lost. It was an opportunity to anchor his drifting life. Soon, they had a family. 2 sons were born, Prince Nicholas and Prince Karl Vladimir. But the very foundations of their life together were unstable. The pressures that had haunted Andrew's youth, the lack of a defined purpose and constant financial anxiety, did not disappear. In fact, they intensified, and the marriage crumbled under the weight of it. ending in divorce in 1962. A year later, he tried again, marrying another German princess, Kira of Leiningen. This second union produced 3 more children, but it followed the same tragic pattern. He truly tried, to create for his children the world that had been stolen from him, but he could not give what he himself did not have. The second marriage also fell apart, leaving him a twice-divorced father of 5 with no kingdom, no career, and a mountain of debt. This second failure would have been even more devastating than the first. It confirmed a pattern of instability and cemented his reputation as a man whose personal life was in disarray. It also left him with even more complex and overwhelming financial obligations. He was now in his 40s, a twice-divorced father of 5, with no kingdom, no career, and a mountain of debt. The hope and optimism of his youth had curdled into a grim cycle of failure and disillusionment. It was around this time that Prince Andrew made a life-altering decision. He decided to leave Europe behind and move to the United States. His elder brother, the former King Peter, had already spent years there, living a troubled life that was a cautionary tale in its own right. But for Andrew, America may have represented something that Europe could no longer offer, a chance to escape. He could escape the rigid expectations of European society, escape the constant, silent judgment of his royal peers, and escape the ghosts of his past that haunted every corner of London. America was the land of the fresh start, a place where a man could reinvent himself, where his past didn't have to define his future. But the American dream for a man like Andrew was a double-edged sword. While his title might have been a novelty in New York or California, it lacked the deep-rooted historical significance it held in Europe. It didn't open the same doors. He was just another European with a fancy accent and a complicated story. The move, intended to be a liberation, may have resulted in the most profound isolation he had ever experienced. He was now an ocean away from his children, from his mother, and from the few remaining structures of the royal world that had, for all its faults, been his home. He had severed his last ties to the old world, only to find himself a stranger in the new one. As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, Prince Andrew was a man adrift. He was middle-aged, his health likely beginning to show the strain of years of stress and worry. He was a father to 5 children who were growing up largely without him. He was a prince of a country that had been under the iron rule of Marshal Tito for decades, a country that had all but forgotten his family's name. The handsome, hopeful young man who had married a princess in a grand royal wedding was gone. In his place was a man haunted by failure, burdened by financial desperation, and shrouded in a deep and pervasive loneliness. The stage was being set for the final tragic act of his life. His last years were spent primarily in Irvine, California. Imagine the stark, almost cruel contrast. This was a man born in the fairy tale setting of Bled, raised in the grand palaces of Belgrade. His world had been one of ancient traditions, of European history, of courtly protocol. Irvine in the 1980s was the epitome of the new American suburb, a master-planned community of clean streets, identical houses, and shopping malls. It was a world of relentless sunshine and forward-looking optimism, a world with no memory and little time for the tragic histories of fallen European dynasties. For a man like Andrew, steeped in the past, it must have felt like living on the moon. This anonymity, which he may have once craved as an escape, likely curdled into a profound and suffocating loneliness. He was far from his children, far from the Serbian diaspora, and a world away from the last vestiges of the royal circles that had once been his life. The central grinding reality of these final years was financial desperation. The constant humiliating pressure of debt and his inability to meet his obligations to his children was a relentless source of stress and shame. This wasn't the noble poverty of a romantic hero. It was the grim, everyday struggle of bills and creditors. For a man raised with the expectation of immense wealth and status, this inability to provide, this failure to master the basic mechanics of a normal life, would have been a source of deep personal anguish. It was the ultimate symbol of his powerlessness, a daily reminder of everything he had lost. In 1988, amidst this period of struggle, he married for a third and final time. His wife was Eva Maria Angelkovich. Unlike his first two wives, she was not a German princess. She was of Serbian descent, a connection perhaps to the homeland that was now a distant memory. This marriage was not a grand royal alliance. It was likely a final quiet search for companionship, a grasp for a human connection in the lonely landscape of his American exile. But it came too late. The cumulative weight of his life's disappointments was becoming unbearable. The marriage would last only 2 years, ending with his death. To understand what happened next, we must look beyond the immediate circumstances and see the tragic trajectory of his entire life. His was a soul burdened by a succession of profound traumas. It began at age 5 with the brutal murder of his father, a loss that shattered his childhood and destabilized his world. It continued with the terror of the Nazi invasion and the chaotic flight into exile, ripping him from his homeland as a young boy. Then came the political betrayal by the Allies and the formal abolition of the monarchy, a public and legal erasure of his identity and future. His adult life was a relentless series of personal failures, each one amplifying the last. The 2 divorces were not just marital breakdowns. They were the collapse of his attempts to build a stable life, and they left him with crushing financial and emotional burdens. His inability to find a meaningful career left him with a gnawing sense of purposelessness. And finally, the deep social isolation of his life in America severed his last connections to a supportive community. Taken together, this is a portrait of a man slowly drowning. His life was a case study in the invisible wounds of history. He was suffering from what we would today likely diagnose as severe, chronic depression, fueled by unresolved trauma and relentless stress. But in his time, and especially in his circles, mental health was a deeply taboo subject. A prince did not complain. A man, a soldier's son, did not admit to weakness. So he likely suffered in silence, his inner turmoil hidden from the world until it became all-consuming. On May 7, 1990, the struggle ended. In his garage in Irvine, California, Prince Andrew of Yugoslavia took his own life. He died by carbon monoxide poisoning, running a pipe from his car's exhaust into the vehicle. It was a deliberate, planned, and desperate act. The official investigation confirmed it as a suicide, finding no evidence of foul play. The news was a quiet shock. A prince of the house of Karađorđević had died, not on a battlefield, not in a palace, but alone in his car, in a suburban garage, an ocean away from the land of his birth. He was 60 years old. His death was the final tragic irony of his life. He was a man defined by his name, yet he died in anonymity. He was a product of Europe's grand historical conflicts. Yet his end was a quiet, personal tragedy. Some early inaccurate reports even placed his death in England, a final confusion that seemed to underscore how untethered and lost his life had become. In the aftermath of his death, the question arose of where to lay him to rest. He could not be buried in the homeland that had disowned him. A place was found for him at the New Gračanica monastery in Third Lake, Illinois. This beautiful Serbian Orthodox monastery is a major spiritual and cultural center for the Serbian diaspora in America. Here, among his people, in the soil of his adopted country of exile, Prince Andrew was buried. It was a dignified resting place, but it was still a grave in a foreign land, a final testament to his life as an exile. And for more than 2 decades, that is where his story seemed to end. A tragic life, a quiet death, a lonely grave. But history, in its own slow and unpredictable way, was not finished with Prince Andrew. But history was not finished with Prince Andrew. After the fall of communism and the violent breakup of the very Yugoslavia his father had built, a new Serbia emerged, one willing to reconcile with its royal past. In 2013, the government made a historic decision. It was time to bring the lost royals home. In an extraordinary state ceremony, the remains of Prince Andrew, his brother King Peter II, and their mother Queen Maria were exhumed from their graves across the world and flown to Belgrade. Met with full military honors, the exiled family had, for the first time in over 70 years, returned to their homeland. Their final destination was the royal mausoleum at Oplenac in the heart of Serbia. This stunning white marble church, built by Andrew's grandfather, King Peter I, is the sacred resting place of the dynasty. In a solemn state ceremony, Prince Andrew was finally laid to rest beside the very man whose death had set his tragic life in motion, his father, King Alexander I. The quiet, sensitive boy who had been cast out into the world had, at long last, come home. The story of Prince Andrew of Yugoslavia is, in the end, a profound and deeply human tragedy. His life was not one of great deeds or political triumphs. He was a man who was largely a victim of his circumstances, a footnote in the grand, violent history of the 20th century. But his story has a resonance that transcends his title. It is a stark and powerful reminder of the invisible psychological cost of political upheaval, of the devastating toll that the loss of identity, homeland, and purpose can take on a human soul. His life is a quiet but powerful argument for the importance of compassion and a deeper understanding of mental health. He remains a part of Serbia's history, a symbol of a generation of royals displaced by war and ideology. But more than that, his journey from a lonely death in a California garage to a state funeral in the land of his ancestors is a testament to the enduring power of memory, heritage, and a nation's need to finally make peace with all of its ghosts. It is a story of a prince who lost everything, but who, in the very end, found his way home.